This video is brought to you by Zarrakan Productions, an umbrella group composed of over 10 shows and an archive of over 5,000 videos covering a wide variety of topics. Please go to zarrakan.com for a complete listing of video links, social media feeds, and opportunities to support our content. Thank you for your time, and may I present another Zarrakan production. Welcome to Virtual World Traveler. I am your camera cat showing you some of the amazing places I have seen. This is a video I made about Roddenberry Nexus by Roddenberry Entertainment at Sansar, the final frontier of fan engagement. Experience the legacy of Roddenberry in a whole new way, with never-before-seen props, costumes, and so much more. Please join me as I explore Roddenberry Nexus.
Since 1966, my father's vision for the future has helped shape a lot of lives. I've met people from all walks of life: artists, teachers, scientists, social leaders, countless people who saw something in Star Trek that made them want to do more, to be more. The Roddenberry Nexus in Sansar is a place for people to explore the ideas that have inspired so many. Through curated shows, historical artifacts, special events, and more, the Nexus is more than just a celebration of the past. It's a place where new works emerge, where new bonds are formed, and where new visions come to light. It's exciting to bring these visions of the future to people on this emerging platform. We hope you'll make the Roddenberry Nexus in Sansar your place for inspiration.
The action figure prototype you're looking at now is one of the most important in Trek history. As Playmates Toys' Star Trek license was winding down in 2001, another company named Palisade Toys stepped in with a bold idea for a type of diorama two-set action figure collection that had never been done before. James T. Kirk, sitting in his command chair, paired with the first ever action figure of Star Trek creator Gene Roddenberry. The figures only got as far as the prototype stage due to two problems, one being getting the likenesses approved, and the other running up against deadlines and retailer uncertainty about whether or not they wanted to carry another new Star Trek line. What you're holding in your hands and what you're looking at right now is a very special item. It was intended for the 35th anniversary, and it was probably the most advertised non-produced figure in Star Trek history. It was discussed in magazines like Star Trek Communicator. It was even solicited within those magazines, and so many fans got an idea of what they were going to get, and unfortunately, they never got it. This is John Tenuto. I'm a sociology professor at the College of Lake County in Grayslake, Illinois, and also write for StarTrek.com, and you can catch me in the Netflix TV show, The Toys That Made Us.
My mother, Majel Barrett Roddenberry, she was an incredibly strong woman. She really didn't take no from anyone. When she set her mind to something, she would definitely do it. That's at least how she was on the outside. Like most humans, she was very tender and loving once you were able to get through the thick skin. Back in the day, my parents were members of this pretty exclusive club, and it was back when they used to have a men's day in the restaurant. And I believe it was every Thursday. It was only men that were allowed in there. Well, my mother would have none of that. My mother would walk in there and sit down with the guys and tell the same jokes they would, and not a single person would ever ask her to leave, because they know if they did, they would get an earful. While she came off very strong and directed and focused, she was flawed, and she had moments of weakness like all of us. When she was supporting Star Trek and promoting my father and supporting the fans, she knew exactly what she was doing. But after my father passed away, she needed the feedback from the fans. She needed to hear from them whether she was doing it right, whether she was living up to their expectation, whether she was able to carry on the torch. She knew she couldn't fill his shoes, but she knew she was the only one there at that time that was able to represent his vision for the future and stand up for the fans. So it was critical to her that she heard from the fans, and she got to engage with the fans and hear their response to anything she put out there. And that was something that I think was very near and dear to her. There was an actual relationship she had with everyone out there. She knew that they had kept Star Trek alive for so long, and now it was her responsibility. She knew that she had to be the one Roddenberry now leading that vision of a better future and keeping that vision alive.
These are background wrist communicators first built for Star Trek The Motion Picture. They were built by Brick Price Movie Miniatures. None of the markings on these communicators match because they were never intended to be seen up close or next to each other. These communicators were made of lightweight vacuum-formed body shells, and in doing so could also be used for stunt work if need be. I'm Max Cervantes. I was a prop maker, actor, and designer for Star Trek The Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, Enterprise, and the other live-action feature films.
This piece is a poster featuring Gene Roddenberry on his lecture circuit tour, hitting colleges. This is from Freeborn Auditorium at University of California at Davis, and you too could have gone to that even if you weren't a student, if you could cough up the $2.25 for general admission. This is probably from the early 80s, and to be quite honest, most of the time the posters for that lecture circuit were done as mimeographed or Xerox single pages. This is a little bit nicer version, more like a concert poster that you would find on a college campus. The thing that's interesting to me about Gene Roddenberry doing the college circuit is that this is really the time between Star Trek the original series and Star Trek the Next Generation that he was building his image as the great bird of the galaxy. Obviously, he was very well respected. He had a lot of fans from the original series, but this is really where he started to hammer out his view of the future. And futurist Gene Roddenberry is the person who sat down to create the world of Star Trek The Next Generation and 24th Century Trek that we know from there on out. The reason I picked this artifact is that I had the opportunity to see Gene Roddenberry at one of those college lectures. I was a lot younger. I was about 10 years old, and this would have been between Star Trek The Wrath of Khan and The Search for Spock. So the question on everybody's mind was, will Spock come back? And naturally, he didn't answer that at all. But what he did is do what he typically did at these events. We started out in one auditorium where he showed the 16mm version of the unaired pilot, The Cage, which nobody had seen up until that point, hadn't aired on TV at all, couldn't get it on videotape. And then we all moved into another auditorium where he did his speech and did a Q&A and still avoided those questions about the fate of Spock.
As a designer of over 30 years and a Trek fan and even longer than that, I needed to create a central repository. No one had it, and it's just a little hole that I think needed to be filled in the Star Trek universe. So I started searching the internet for insignias that other people had taken from the show and redrawn, and screen grabs, and the big sites like Memory Alpha, and started going through them and realized that there were large holes in the compendium, the collection of Star Trek graphic design. So I decided that then and there it was time to create that repository, and started going through each Star Trek one by one. Every time that a symbol would appear that we could attach to something, there are a lot of marks that don't go anywhere, but there are a lot of marks that can be assigned to a particular race or a particular thing in Star Trek, and started taking screen captures and using those as templates to redraw as faithfully as I could how they appeared in the episode or the movie of Star Trek. Over the years, I always said, oh God, my perfect job would have been working under Mike Ikuda, designing for Star Trek. I'm sure there are a lot of kids out there who are going to be doing the same thing in the future. And I wanted a reference point that anyone could come to and see the real artwork that appeared in the shows, in the movies, in as high a quality reproduction as I could possibly achieve based on the artwork that appears in canon. I'm Brad Wilder, and I created StarTrekDesignProject.com.
what's so fascinating about these storyboards, and for those of you who don't know, storyboards are a way that filmmakers use a conceptual artist to illustrate what a scene will eventually look like in a finished film. And why do we do that? The reason is so that specifically when the visual effects are designed, effort isn't wasted on shots that won't show up in the finished movie, or at least that's the idea behind it. So more often than not, storyboards are used for complicated visual effects scenes and action scenes. They can also be done for standard dialogue scenes for a director to plan out certain angles. Hitchcock, of course, was famous for literally storyboarding every shot of his movie, and he basically felt that he had finished shooting a movie before he even began filming, because he had literally storyboarded every frame. And for him, the production of the film was the least interesting part of making the movie. In the case of the legendary Star Trek the Motion Picture, it's a particularly fascinating story because, of course, you're looking at a movie that began its life as a TV movie for the never-produced Star Trek Phase 2 in the late 70s, and then became a motion picture, first a lower-budget motion picture and then a higher-budget motion picture. Here we're looking at storyboards of the Enterprise, the beautiful ship, designed, of course, a combination of Mike Miner, Andrew Probert, jumping to warp. Now, this is very different than the TV series, of course, and it was important to the filmmakers Bob Wise and Gene Roddenberry that there be something special. Eventually, as you'll see, the finished effect is somewhat different. It's sort of a rainbow kaleidoscope, but in this we see the Enterprise as it jumps to warp. And of course, it was really important for Gene Roddenberry to ground these kind of effects in actual science. So a warp bubble is literally created, allowing the Enterprise to travel faster than light. And Gene, of course, consulted with everyone from legendary science fiction authors like Isaac Asimov, and then he had Jessica Van Puttenmaker, who was the science advisor on Star Trek the Motion Picture. This was something that was very important to him. Particularly throughout the 70s, you see Gene consulting with all manner of experts on science and the future, and incorporating that. And of course, that's where the idea of sort of a warp bubble comes from, whereas originally for the TV series, it was just a way to account for a ship that went faster than light, because it wouldn't be a very interesting TV series if a starship couldn't travel faster than light. You'd be spending 9 episodes getting to whatever planet you were trying to get to in the solar system, let alone the galaxy. So there you have it. You see the very early iterations of the Enterprise jumping to warp speed for Star Trek the Motion Picture, an effect that was subsequently modified for Star Trek the Next Generation, in which the Enterprise is sort of elasticized, but very much grounded in the groundbreaking work of Star Trek the Motion Picture in 1979. This is Mark A. Altman, a writer-producer for television, including such shows as The Librarians and Agent X and Castle, as well as the author of the best-selling 2-volume oral history of Star Trek, The 50-Year Mission. In this sequence, of course, is storyboards of the V'ger probe on board the Enterprise and Star Trek the Motion Picture. This is a really fascinating sequence for many reasons. And of course, storyboards are used by the director and producer to lay out a scene for the visual effects artist so that unnecessary, superfluous work isn't done for stuff that won't be used in the movie. And of course, this is primarily something that's done with visual effects and with complicated action scenes, although some directors will basically storyboard every scene, including the dialogue, for their DP, and that could be a product of a creative desire or for budget or time. What you'll see is something that's somewhat different than the finished version. Of course, that has a lot to do with the fact that Brand Farron, the visual effects company that had been brought on to Phase 2 and the original lower budget version in thy image of Star Trek: The Motion Picture did the initial effects. And in fact, there's very little of the Brand Farron effects left in the picture. Although, if you look carefully, this is one sequence where there is a fair amount of the work done by Brand Farron that still remains in the picture from before Doug Trumbull and John Dykstra's Apogee came on the picture. You had two of the biggest high-profile effects companies in the business that took over when it was clear that Robert Abel could not deliver the quality or the quantity of visual effects in time to make a December 7th release date. So you see something, the depiction of the Voyager probe is very different when it infiltrates the bridge. There is a famous deleted scene here where after Chekhov is wounded at his station, the security station, Persis Kambata's Ilea comes and sort of soothes him because, of course, she is a Deltan. And there's a lot more about this in Gene Roddenberry's novelization of the picture, which explains sort of their free love, sexual energy that she is able to basically soothe his wounds until Christine Chapel is able to come to the bridge and apply a hypo to reduce his pain. Star Trek: The Motion Picture, sort of the Rodney Dangerfield of the Star Trek franchise. It often gets diminished. People call it the motionless picture, or so the odd-numbered Star Treks are not as good. But for those of us who were there on December 7th, 1979, we remember the amazing impact that this movie had on us. There had been no new Star Trek since 1969 other than the animated series, and there had been, of course, rumors and false starts with the Phase 2 series, which was going to air on the Paramount Channel. Never happened. So the fact that Star Trek actually came back, it came back in theaters. This was at a time where it was a rarity to see a movie based on a TV show become spring into existence, let alone a failed TV series. Often you saw compilations of stuff like The Man from U.N.C.L.E. or the rare occasion like when Batman 1966 was produced during the heyday of that successful TV series, but never a show that came back 10 years after the sort of low-rated failure after 3 seasons on NBC. So it was remarkable to sit in that theater and have that curtain closed and hear that Jerry Goldsmith overture, and to see the vast canvas that this film took place on. And while the story, owes a debt to the Changeling and the Doomsday Machine, it really is a movie about ideas and about character, and it's a beautifully shot and visualized motion picture with gorgeous miniatures, and it's I think a mistake to try and diminish or dismiss this movie. It also, of course, is the last movie in which Gene Roddenberry was intimately involved with the production until he would return to launch Star Trek: The Next Generation several years later, because the movie series was then handed to Harve Bennett, who produced 2 through 5, and then Ralph Winter taking over Star Trek 6, which was the end of the original film series. But Star Trek: The Motion Picture is a significant motion picture, I think, in not only motion picture history, but for any Star Trek fan, certainly any fan of the original series. And while it certainly has its faults, I think what it does successfully it far exceeds and if we are to penalize it, it should only be for its reach, exceeding its grasp. But again, dealing with heady, cerebral ideas, it's the last of the Star Trek films to really be influenced by 2001: A Space Odyssey. You sort of see later on, even with the great Wrath of Khan, that these are movies that owe a debt more to Star Wars than they do to the sort of deep ideas of 2001, which was, of course, the case that Philip Kaufman, when he developed his version of a Star Trek motion picture many years earlier called Planet of the Titans, was very much inspired by Kubrick. Now, whether or not we would still be talking about Star Trek all these years later, had Star Trek continued to go in this direction of sort of 2001 awe-inspiring cerebral mind trips, probably not. But I think that Star Trek: The Motion Picture is a movie that deserves our respect, and just in these few images, you can see some of the exciting ideas that went into the formative stages of this movie. This is Mark A. Altman, writer-producer for film and television, including such shows as The Librarians, Agent X, and Castle. I'm also the co-author of the 50-Year Mission, the definitive oral history of Star Trek from St. Martin's Press, and the upcoming So Say We All, an oral history of Battlestar Galactica. Thanks for letting me talk Trek with you today.
Lackluster animation, repetitive music, dozens of characters voiced by a cast of 3 to 5 people. Say what you will about the animated series' flaws, and yeah, there were lots of flaws. As much negative as you might have to say, though, this was real Star Trek. Gene Roddenberry, DC Fontana, David Gerrold, Larry Niven. Star Trek writers and science fiction writers were happy to welcome Kirk, Spock, McCoy, and the rest of the crew of the Enterprise back to TV. The animated series even gave Walter Koenig his first on-screen writing credit. But it's not just the big names and pointy ears that make this show Star Trek. The animated series tackled big issues. Yesteryear dealt with grown-up decisions children might have to make. Eye of the Beholder encouraged kids to look at situations from all sides. The Magics of Magus 2 led kids to question whether what they'd been told about God and the devil was true. All on a Saturday morning, while their parents slept in the next room. I'm Ken Ray, from Mission Log, a Roddenberry Star Trek podcast. This is a photograph of a background plate used in the production of Star Trek, the animated series. It's the bridge of the Enterprise, stretched out to accommodate for camera movement and the placement of characters at different perspectives, giving the illusion of greater depth. The photograph was likely used by animators to test out the shots before the final was filmed on the original background plate. In the photo, you can see the holes where the background plate would have been mounted to hold it and the animation cells steady. I'm Ken Ray, from Mission Log, a Roddenberry Star Trek podcast.
This transporter effect art is fascinating for a couple of reasons. Well, it was done in April of 1978, so leading up to the production of Star Trek the Motion Picture. I love that at that early stage, every detail of Star Trek was being reinvented, reimagined for moving to the big screen. And we see in the notes here that one of the things the artist wants to see is that the person being transported can actually move. So unlike during the TV show, where you would use a freeze frame and then apply the effect on top, with the bigger budget, bigger scale of a motion picture, you can now have the person actually in motion, although not too much, as the artist points out. And that's something that we did see in the motion picture and really saw in The Wrath of Khan, where Kirk and Saavik are having a conversation as they beam over to Regular One. The other thing that I like about this art is that the style of the transporter effect is something that we actually got to see much later on. So fast forward more than 30 years, and in the J.J. Abrams Star Trek movie of 2009, that transporter effect had the same kind of vortex effect, the circular lines around the person beaming out. It was a much more sophisticated, much more effects-heavy type of shot. And we know that the artists working on that movie didn't have this same reference art available to them, but it's incredible how similar those two concepts are, spread out over more than 30 years. I'm John Champion from Mission Log, a Roddenberry Star Trek podcast.